project coordinated by Alex Cistelecan, Dana Domsodi, Attila, Tordai, and myself. Just a quick reminder before we start. This project's main goal is to identify those resources of modernity, like critical rationality, universalism, and egalitarianism, that still allow us to hope in overcoming the current ecological crisis of capitalism. We started this series of lectures before the pandemic. It seems far away now. Last year's January with Gareth Dale, who also joined us tonight, with a lecture on degrowth, technology, and the Green New Deal. Then we had Juana Mateescu with a lecture on AI Commons. Then we followed with Natalia Buya with a lecture on Spanish railway network and capitalist eco-modernization. And we had also Adrian Grama and Stefan Guga with forces and relations of production now and then. We continue tonight this series with a lecture by Cornel Ban on the political economy of the European Green Deal, on Europe's Green Enlightenment, as he calls it, and the climate crisis. Cornel Ban is an associate in the national political economy at Copenhagen Business School. He wrote 2 books on the politics of economic expertise and income distribution, macroeconomic policy shifts and organizational shifts in international financial institutions, and capitalist diversity in Brazil, Spain, and Romania. One of the 2 books, Dependență și Dezvoltare, on the political economy of Romanian capitalism, was published also in Romania. He's currently working on growth regimes, finance in the climate crisis, and the political economy of the entrepreneurial state. Cornel, the floor is yours.
Well, jó estét, köszönöm, merci de invitație. Hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me and for accommodating my request that this be done in English. I regularly self-delude a little bit that I can give a fluid presentation in Romanian, knowing there's 60 or so people on the other hand. I usually don't. So this is when that shame ends. So I'm working for now 4 or 5 years on the question of what to do about the apocalypse, right? And it's a question that requires a sort of certain techno theological approach almost to the matter. One wonders if it's better to engage it with fiction rather than with social sciences. But here we go. Let's take a dive into it. And you've all seen the abstract of the presentation. Let me share a little bit the screen here. So Europe stares into the climate chaos, and I'm not going to go over the scientific facts. They're pretty obvious. I'm not going to go over newspaper reported information about what the European Commission is planning to do with the member states and so on and so forth. And I'll try to deliver something of value added if it's possible. And I had an interesting day today, a bit of a roller coaster. I read a short book by Jeff Mann and friends, which was from the now burgeoning, vague left eco-social political theory. Very nice critique and sort of very frustrating, vague charting out of what's the end game of this particular left political project. I've also read a very entertaining and laughable apocalyptic liberal climate fiction category. I didn't read them all today, but over the weekend, let's say. They sort of present anti-mask community, and it's frustrating to think about these topics while not even faced with a pandemic. We can deal with a sort of rejuvenation of the critical thinking that this critical rational thinking that this seminar is supposed to engage with. So the premise I'm dealing with is that there is a death wish that's widespread in the way in which socio-economic systems are organized today. The science is very clear, and I like the metaphor of a pyramid scheme that we are playing with ourselves. It's one of the most absurd games out there, but that's what it is. So if the science is right, and I'm not a scientist, so I delegate that particular function to scientists. If they're right, we're heading at a 2% warming at the current business as usual, which is pretty nightmarish. I mean, just if you think about the 600 million climate refugees, and if you think about end of life as we know it, and so on and so forth, things are very obvious there. And of course, there are many scenarios, but none of them is actually, even the most optimistic of them, provides us with any possibility of defending the status quo as it is. Of course, there are some bankers in Washington that still do it. Now, I use the term Cul de Sac economics because what I mean by it is that, as you know, this is a typical suburban development in the United States, post-war period. It's like a prestigious real estate move in which there are 2 lanes and these nice houses around it. Basically, the idea is that we started in, say, 1990 level of emissions, which are considered to be the benchmarks, and we're hitting the Cul de Sac. I mean, we have to turn around. There's no way of going beyond it. And it seems like this is what we are trying to do. I mean, we're driving through the Cul de Sac at the current pace. And I see Gareth Dale here and a few others who have written endlessly about the indefensibility of the sort of current green liberalism as a sustainable and real solution to what's going on. So that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to do is first chart out 4 futures based on what's going on. So 1 present and 3 futures. I will not express a preference for it. I'm looking at the room. I'm betting that about 75% would like to find themselves into a green eco-socialist project. But that's not my job. My job is not to defend a sort of normative position on any of this, but to say what Europe is doing and where the current European Union's archipelago of initiatives is likely to land us if implemented. And beyond that, if it's not implemented to the letter, but rather in excess of it, what are the possibilities with which this program is pregnant with? And I have a much more optimistic perspective on that, delusional as it might be, than I had it, say, a year ago. Now, of course, we live under, in the best of all worlds, we live under green liberalism. Most of it is essentially brown, but let's give it the benefit of the doubt and say, well, it is most serious liberals today would defend the case that this is a market failure we are living through. Markets are unable to deal our survival. So read the Stern report and other super elites. Deutsche Bank, for example, has a report on this. They basically say climate change is the biggest market failure in history, period. I mean, this is the starting point, okay? What's the solution that is provided by them? The polluter pays taxes principle, right? This leads to the internalization of market externalities, which means that investors would then, faced with these taxes, they would move into green projects green consumption will be taxed, and we'll all naturally move through the price mechanism into a sort of equilibrium with nature again. That's the if we are entirely fair to this, rather than oversimplify what these people are saying. So they also go a little bit beyond that and say, well, this kind of monetarist, neoliberal era of tight money is over. We should have low interest forever, because that means that that financial investors would then take more risks and go into private green projects. The state maybe should intervene a little bit as well by de-risking these projects, like paying for some of, say, putting up solar panels everywhere. The state pays 30% and makes them less risky for financial investors to pay the other 70%, right? The World Bank is pushing this in the Global South, for example. At the end of the day, it's market-based governance with a little bit of nudging from the state, to use a famous sociological phrase. The world continues as usual, liberal politics. The super elites will adapt themselves and buy islands and go to the moon and all kinds of projects in this regard. But it's all very linear. It's basically Smith, Ricardo, a little bit of science on top of it. And the end game is that, if things go bad, then we go into a sort of G2 world. On the one hand, you have, what I'll call later on the climate Mao, which is the sort of like Chinese solution to this problem of controlling investment and consumption in a way that ensures at least climate adaptation is not survival. On the one hand, and on the other hand, the other part of the G2, sort of a US-led Leviathan that's armed with climate geoengineering, right? Which is very much consistent with the US military complex. All right, this is green liberalism. This is where most of Europe is today. Let's not delude ourselves. We're at the beginning of a transformational process. This is where Europe was, I would say, in 2019 in the summer. But since 2019 in the summer, something has changed at the EU level. And the sort of optimistic message here is that what changed is that there was this kind of green wave in the European elections and a bunch of critical national elections. And as a result of that, the new European Commission, which oddly enough is led by a conservative woman, has felt like they had a democratic legitimacy to push for a sort of bolder, in liberal terms, attempt to provide the European solution to adaptation, at least, right? So what I think is happening now, a situation emboldened by the sort of manifold social and financial crises that are taking place around us, is that, in a sense, the state is back. The state has bailed out the financial sector, but has also discovered a taste for its own capacity after decades of emaciation. And this kind of left-green Keynesianism is very much the sort of potential in which the European Green Deal can go into, provided it is supported by more, what I'll describe later, climate X movements, right? So I think people who reduce the European Green Deal to a purely technocratic project misunderstand the politics behind it. There is a very clean and clear movement in the core countries, and as we know, the core countries are the ones that matter because they put up the money, towards not just talking green, but actually committing real resources. And for the first time ever, with COVID, really helped tremendously. We have some major financial commitments from the EU in fiscal terms, also in financial terms. I'll briefly discuss that. So the basic idea here is, how can we do this? Several pathways. One is to basically use fiscal spending, finance from that. That's basically the COVID package that we have now. Hasn't kicked in yet, but it will in the fall. To do what? Transform the energy system, green research and development, to basically break into new technologies. But also, they're not betting on that very much. They're betting mostly on using the existing technologies and reducing their price through more research. Green jobs, some kind of version of the just transition, which is not very just or well financed, but we'll find out later. Basically subsidize green sectors and then tax the brown sectors. Green monetary policy, basically, that means interest rates that vary by the degree of greenness. There is discussion about this in the European Central Bank. The expansion of green public banks. We have the European investment banks and this kind of coterie of financial institutions that are publicly owned in Europe. Contrary to conventional wisdom, European states are, especially the German state, own a lot of financial capital. And up to 40% of their commitments, loan commitments, are to green activities, right? There's also increasingly a sort of green neo-mercantilist turn. What we mean by that is, limits on capital movement have been tried in Cyprus, have been tried in a couple of settings, which ushered in a conversation about taxing financial flows, which was a proposal supported, by the way, by Germany. And that might come back because of the reasons I'm going to talk about later. Also, trade flows. Trade flows are no longer free after the European Green Deal. They are going to tax imports of carbon intensive stuff. So, say soy from Brazil that's harvested in the Amazon. I mean, all soy from Brazil, because they're under this suspicion. Will be taxed heavily, right? The age of free trade is a bit of a joke, right, today. So it's not a free markets that lead the process, as in the green liberal world. It is more like a technocratic big government scaled at the regional level, right? Which is a very important point, because the critique of eco-socialists is to say, well, Keynesianism sounds nice, you can even radicalize it with a bit more syndicalism, but it only works at the national level. It worked with a closed economy. Well, that criticism is kind of defeated now, increasingly, by the fact that we can scale up a left-green Keynesianism at the European level. Okay, so it kind of, you have Smith and Ricardo in the first, you have List and Keynes in the second. So a mix of kind of macroeconomic and structural policies that is much more, is extremely different from the green liberalism. Now, the big competitor to both these first two projects is what has been called by Jeff Mann, Green Mao. I mean, basically, you have this kind of authoritarian consultative state. It's not a purely authoritarian, and it's not just China, by the way. It's also Singapore. Potentially, things hit the fan. Other countries with high capacity states in Asia. So essentially, it's a green technocracy that saves and punishes. That goes beyond monetary fiscal policy and R&D and all kinds of like supply side measures, and goes into like a more centralized planning of investment, consumption, also repression and destruction, because centralizing repression and destruction becomes essential to reducing some forms of consumption, keeping refugees out, and so on and so forth. Now, all of this is powered by what, right? It is powered, of course, by economic legitimacy on which this authoritarian, in which the Chinese system relies on, and also international competitiveness, because this green transition is not just about, survival. It also lines up with green capital's interests to innovate the technologies of the greener future, and therefore reap the benefits of the first mover, right? Reap all the rents from intellectual capital that come with it, right? So this is very much based around national sovereignty. Read, Ming Lee has an article on this whereby he defines it. Now, this is finally the fourth eco-political project that has some traction in intellectual circles and some sort of movements in Europe. Fridays, some parts of the Fridays for Future, etc. Is eco-socialism with radical democracy, the so-called climate tax. I'm citing Jeff Mann as well. So basically, I mean, it's very stimulating to read about this. I find it extremely vague. And I think most of us would rather live under an eco-socialist system that with a non-violent transition rather than in Green Mao or certainly green liberalism. I think there's some competition from, in my book at least, from left-wing Keynesianism, right? In the sense, there's very little specification as to what this would look like, what kind of firms, what kind of forms of organization. We know that it's something based around It's inspired very much by big growth, austere consumption of goods, but ample consumption of public services and leisure. There isn't so much clarity on these details. I mean, there is, which is a problem. We can talk about it philosophically, but it's a problem I attribute to generally the Marxist conversation on this, right? Because it's not about the state of affairs that has to be specified, but rather to bolster the real movement that abolishes the present state of things, right? This is not about states or about Leviathan. It's about multiplicity, not about soul. So who powers this? Who are the actors? Well, you know, beyond movements and some cooperative economics, I had a hard time finding details because there is a suspicion of the state, whereas the state in left-green Keynesianism is very specific, you know, a strong state, the disciplines and markets, etc. I'm less clear about what this refers to. So what we have in Europe, like I said, is basically a mix between left-green Keynesianism as like the big potential and a kind of gradual abandonment of green liberalism. This is what's happening not just at the EU level, but at the level of the dynamics of some key member states. And I think that we could unify some of the strands in this thinking, including the eco-socialist one, under the aegis of a very simplified definition of the Enlightenment as collective rational learning process. It brings out the irrationality of our collective socioeconomic foundations to the surface through both struggle and consensus. Right? This is no longer a Eurocentric concept. Enlightenment is no longer you know, you can find it today in all kinds of like decolonial perspectives as well. I think we should basically, my position on this is very clear. I think we should save the concept of the Enlightenment from the clause of Adorno and Horkheimer, but we could talk about it later on. I just want to basically brand this as a kind of second chance of Enlightenment. I may sound a little bit Habermasian, but I don't want to go all the way in that direction. So it sounds a little bit like Enlightenment because as you'll find out later on, it's about education against obscurantism. It's about strong state against today neo-medieval vested interests that maintain this kind of obscurantist liberal delusion of green liberal solutions and constitutional rule against the permanent states of exception that the Green Mao hypothesis brings to the fore. Okay. Now, if we actually organize the thinking around some of the key ingredients of what will make these eco-political projects have traction, and have traction in real existing economic interests, real existing societal motivation, the technological situation, and their decarbonization impact, right? We know that green liberalism is a failure. So its decarbonization impact is very low. It has some support with critical fractions of capital, but many of those fractions are breaking away from it, especially in, say, pension funds, some sovereign wealth funds, definitely in Europe, central banking community, some asset management. That's already happening. Then there's also, of course, the burgeoning green industrial sector coming out, from green cars to rail. Okay, its democratic appeal is very much undermined by the fact that it both manages to give us anxieties about our death by 2060 or so, but also because it is so horribly inegalitarian, right? So we know the discussion here, no point to dwell on it. It has very high elite support, right? But we also see that weakening in favor of a more Keynesian, green Keynesian approach in Europe. This is all about Europe I'm talking about. It relies on untested technologies. Does it rely very much on untested technologies? Not very much. So overall, because it basically is a failure, even in the elite's view, then I scrapped it for now. The whole point, the whole game here is a transition from green liberalism to left-green Keynesianism. That's the real situation in Europe right now. And in here, there's like some rays of hope, right? In the last 2 years, you have a medium level of support. If you actually map out some of the largest financial and industrial firms in Europe, say from Deutsche Bank to Volkswagen and so on, like people with real money and real political clout. There is interest in this. I mean, one of the reports I've read from the Deutsche Bank that Jeffman cites as well, I mean, it basically sounds like the Roosevelt. I mean, it doesn't sound like a contemporary anymore. Any of these visionary banks, even BlackRock, with all their sort of sinister components, actually see through this. It is a much higher democratic appeal because it promises much better distribution than green liberalism. Right, all of this, there's pushback, of course, from the sort of anti-scientific publics and some of the sort of path-dependent ways of consumption out there. Political elite support is medium in the sense that it's weak in some parts of the European periphery, but also in the European core. Some parties are pushing hard against it on the right. Interestingly, conservative parties have moved in its favor. There is a history of conservatives going Keynesian in the 50s. This wouldn't be new. Its reliance on untested technologies is medium-low. This is another point, another problem I have with some of the work being done on this from the eco-socialist side, who say, well, it depends on technological breakthroughs. It really doesn't. I mean, basically, you can have an energy transition if you have the real money that I'm talking about later on, you can do it without any breakthrough, essentially. Its decarbonization impact remains extremely high, right? There's several simulations of this. It has some weak points. Maybe I should have said medium high, but it is serious, which it should not be dismissed very easily. And then Green Mao basically looks the same, except its democratic appeal is zero. The point is not democratic appeal. The point is legitimacy through quality of life and economic benefits. Now, eco-socialism, of course, looks nice on the things that matter, but it doesn't have any support. I mean, basically runs against the interests of critical capital factions. There's no one I can think of in the business community that would support this. And elite support, of course, lots of hostility, with the exception of a few, Belgian and French parties. You really can't find much of this. Now, the starting points are the following. Okay, Europe has, Europe has done a huge debt to the world in terms of burning fossil fuels for the longest period. But today, it is only the only part of the industrial core, at least, that took upon itself the costs of some kind of like clear financial commitments, clear money, clear strategies, clear sticks and carrots. We see basically discourse coming from Beijing and the US. But if you look at the Biden stimulus, where do you see the green? Where do you see anything close to what the EU is committing, right? China now is announcing 2060 as a target. They've done a lot. I think the Chinese will probably do more than the Americans, but we don't see anything on the scale that Europe is committing. So what does it mean? It means net zero emissions. We all know this in 2050 and 55% drop in 2030. European Parliament is pushing for 60% drop. I don't think that's going to happen. What's interesting about it politically is that it accommodates this green enlightenment, both the sort of green growth and the climate act / degrowth. Some kind of hybrid is likely to emerge should these tensions continue. And once climate change is going to kick the teeth out of the status quo over time, because that's just a scientific fact. So there is this potential, which we don't see clearly articulated in the others. Now, let's start the conversation about how this pans out in Europe from a very simple factoid here. I mean, this is well known. Basically, 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions come from energy. Okay, so most of the conversation I'm going to propose here is going to be about energy. So it's energy, agriculture, forestry, land use, and then a little bit for industry, right? These are the real things. And of course, under energy, it's energy is in industry, transport, and buildings. Now, if you look at the European Green Deal and the next generation COVID package, that's exactly the order in which they organize it. So it is enlightenment in a sense of like scientifically grounded set of priorities. They haven't started with like grantier interest in agriculture, for example. There's also a European reality that you don't find very easily elsewhere. If you look at the electricity production, even at the extremes of the continent, right? If you look at Denmark and Romania, yeah, I mean, you see massive reduction in coal and oil. Of course, in Denmark, it's absolutely astonishing what they've done. They basically eliminate coal almost completely in a few years. And if you look at share of renewables, you see that absolutely, it's a spectacular change as well. So it kind of cuts into much of the public depression. The share of electricity production from fossil fuels, right? Again, these two different countries. Of course, the scale is much bigger in Denmark, but even in Romania, with all of our problems, this is happening. Contrast this with the sort of like climate nihilism we see as well. I mean, look at this is the Chinese and Indian electricity production sources. This is India, right? I mean, it's basically almost all fossil fuels, right? And it hasn't changed since 1985, right? There's no change there. Same thing in China. Despite the massive efforts of the Chinese Communist Party, very little reduction. Electricity production continues to be massively powered by coal and increasingly by hydropower. So if you compare this to pretty much any European country but Poland, the contrasts are violent. The same is true of the US. I mean, US is the same. Essentially, they replaced coal with gas. That was the big move in this sense. So in a way, Europe is kind of unique and a hopeful place to start from. And I don't want to sound too Eurocentric, but these are just facts. Now, if you look at the international level, international institutions, it's basically massive indifference. Until basically last fall, the IMF had nothing to say about this is very much like a US-controlled institution, had nothing to say about climate change in its Article 4, which is the sort of like monitoring of a country's macroeconomy every year, and also the FSAPs, which are the way they look at the financial sector. So this is weird because most central banks since 2015 say climate change is the biggest source of systemic risk in the financial sector. Yet IMF said nothing. So the central banks, of course, are European. The Fed hasn't joined yet. So in a sense, this puts us in the position of asking these concrete questions about Europe, right? What can this green enlightenment deliver? What it aims to do? What kind of reforms of the European political economy are needed to trigger some kind of like global effect, yeah, to keep the world habitable? And finally, how can this green enlightenment avoid authoritarianism? Because we're all sort of stressed by kind of states of exception going wrong, right? And that is not just about Agamben going crazy and not respectable these days, but it is about real concerns that just the massive disruptions caused by climate change that we have seen nothing of until now might change the way our political societies work. Let's run through it a little bit now. So what can it deliver? Like I said, 55 by 2030, net zero by 50, but there's more to it than that, right? It's also about managing European capitalists' expectations upwards, right? Trying to move their money into green. And it is a state-led effort. That's why it's least. It's not Smith. And the fourth way is, I think, the most important one: using Europe's market power, basically, to push others to do similar things. And the way you do that is through this green mercantilism. European Green Deal says explicitly there's going to be taxes on very high import duties on stuff that's produced in the brown economy elsewhere. Like you have to adjust this like European greening of the economy, or you won't make it into the market. And then there's also increasingly there are discussions of European minimum wage, European minimum income. These are very serious at the level of the Commission. There's various models running there. There's a very clear sense that we should build, in case everything goes to hell, at least for a while, to have some kind of safety nets at the European level, and some kind of resilience mechanisms to deal with the medical crises that are coming associated with this climate chaos, to have transportation systems that somehow work and public institutions that somehow work despite the sort of nightmarish scenarios that are kicking in. Now, all of this is filled with anxieties and problems, as you'll see later on. So what's exactly the global green deal? The IMF has a number on it, right? I mean, sometimes when you read a lot of the apocalyptic predictions from science that have no costs attached to it. How much would it cost actually to save our asses? Now, I'm not going to credit the IMF fully for being very accurate, but I think given the standards of competence out there, they're pretty good. They're saying 2.2% of GDP on an annual basis until 2030. That's the first estimate they do. Yeah, for all these kind of other things. How much is this? I mean, this doesn't sound like a lot, but is it a lot? Is it little? We don't know. Let's do some comparisons, right? A lot of people are saying, wow, we have to mobilize like in World War II. Okay, so if we take the IMF study, that kind of correlates, has similar numbers with the recent Princeton study, which I find totally Pollyannish, the so-called Net Zero America, that was written for the Biden administration. So you're looking at essentially 0.5% of US GDP per year, 75% of US defense spending, and 70% of the Iraq war. And you're like, wait a second, is this like, so the whole cost, right, 9.5 trillion, would basically be like avoiding a significant war, which doesn't sound like a lot. So all of the green transition is the Iraq war. Compare this with World War II, which was 130% of GDP. So let's say that the IMF is Pollyannish and it's not 2.2%, let's say it's 10%, right? The 10% is the cost of the the war in Korea. Like this is not crazy money. Now, can the EU budget, so let's say no individual European country is going to spend more on the climate transition, which is an absurd assumption. But let's make this assumption. So EU budget is 1.08 trillion. Yeah, so that's 150 billion a year. It would mean 10 years of EU budgets, right? So 1% of EU GDP levels. Yeah. The usual solutions from the left, which I completely endorse, I'm not going to cut it. So financial transaction tax, 60 billion, closure of tax havens, 60 billions, 100 billion a year from additional EIB lending, already approved, and 30 billion a year from next gen per year, yeah, for just green projects. So that it still leaves us with the green gap of $500 billion on an annual basis, right? So how do we close that? I'm going to jump this here because my time is running quickly. So I'm going to go here and say, how do we close this? Well, first is this is already discussed, already out there. Green monetary and financial regulation policy, right? And it's basically how to move the money from the typical conventional capitalists to make them green them up, yeah? And you can do that through green monetary policy because you just have different interest rates for green assets. The central bank can do a lot. I can get into details later on, but central banks can actually really take a hose into the basement and then beat the hell out of private investors to actually invest in green. They can do that, or they can shut them down. We have this massive firepower. We haven't used it yet. Discussion is there in the European Central Bank Board. It's still not decided yet, but the so-called green haircuts is something that's on the table. Now, expand the European investment state, by which we mean this kind of publicly owned banks. European Investment Bank, the largest, this is bigger than the World Bank. This is the Bank of the European Commission, but also this kind of archipelago of nationally owned public institutions. And if you expand those, then you have a shot at the 550 billion a year target. Change the mandate of the ECB slightly. I mean, we've changed the mandate of the ECB in practice. I mean, both the Fed, the ECB, Bank of England, basically bailed out governments. They bailed out the financial sector. It's not just about inflation now. It's about financial stability. And increasingly, there's conversation in the so-called network for green the financial sector about central banks actually becoming green backers of the green Keynesian state, right? And of course, there's a lot of risk here because the so-called green taxonomy, which is kind of the framework with which you read if an investment is green or not, is being whitewashed as we speak, right? So all of this, like this dialectical pushback, right, coming from capital at this point. What about structural reforms? Whenever we hear the term structural reforms, we understand something like they come and destroy labor unions and they cut welfare benefits and so on. But there's also this other side of structural reforms, right? So there is discussion of a certain return of etatism, yeah, with large-scale indicative planning of investment and green consumption, right? We know this is a consensus. Some forms of consumption are unnecessary, right? You can manage those out of existence. Some forms of investments are ridiculous. You can increase the cost of investing there. This is not operationalized, but these are conversations in policy circles. It would also require, this is going way beyond what's on the table right now, but it would still be under capitalism, right? It would still be under a sort of green enlightenment capitalist world. The largest expansion of public housing and social services in history, basically, because there's going to be millions of climate refugees. There's going to be massively dislocated workers from mining and other things. We have to move them into areas where there's work in decent conditions. Then sort of replicating from China and the US what they do best, which is the American entrepreneurial state, the academic industrial complex, for not necessarily for the green innovations, just making the existing innovations much less expensive. Yeah, I mean, we have operational hydrogen trains. They can replace all diesel trains if we were to reduce the cost, etc., etc. That's exactly what China does very well. Yeah, but the money that Europe commits to this are not enough at this point. Redistribution of work week time. We just can't. It would be impossible to have everyone fully employed at 8 hours a day. It's not actually ideal. I'm all Keynesian on this. I think we should reduce our working time massively and redistribute the time. And the public job guarantee. This is all of this consistent with a sort of Keynesian left green Keynesian view. On fiscal policy, this is already operational. They could get more ambitious, essentially to crack down on tax dodging. And the successes here are mixed, but they are happening. A green financial tax is an obvious thing. The FTT had support with major member states. With another crisis, that could be another shot, and we could add the green component to it. Then carbon taxes on brown activities that within global value chains, because we don't live in Marxist capitalism. We live with firms. Yeah, we live in super complex global value chains in which you have one orchestrating firm and 30,000 so-called partners. Right? That's how Volkswagen operates today. That's something that we have to understand in a different way that requires more economic geography than economics. But unless you tax those brown activities, including these absurd ways in which shipping is organized, and things go from salmon goes from Norway to Thailand to be packed and then comes back in Norway. You know the whole story. This can be taxed, and it wouldn't have massive dislocations that would risk a yellow vest movement. Higher dividend taxes for shareholder value companies. Shareholder value is the sort of most destructive element of the contemporary corporation, and it is of recent vintage. It's from 1980s, right? This didn't exist in the 60s and so on. So in order to lengthen the time horizon of firms and discipline them into a more green way of structuring their existence, these higher dividend taxes for shareholder value will have to kick in. I think this is probably the biggest thing to crack because it is the genome of the contemporary firm. But it is a proposal that I'm hearing among reformists. You can't do all of this unless there's monetary fiscal coordination. Meaning you can't spend all this money, take on all this debt, unless the central bank has your back. So if you read, this is no longer radical stuff. If you read the monthly report of the ECB from February, they're already talking about this, right? I mean, the ECB is managing yields to make sure that Europe can actually pay its way out of COVID. They can do the same to pay for Europe to pay its way out of the climate nightmare, right? And of course, this is the unpopular bid, yeah? Higher VAT on wasteful consumption, because whatever that means can be unpopular. Now, I'm closing my presentation here with the last question, and that is, how can the Green Enlightenment stay basically democratic, right? And this is not from practice, this is from evidence. We know that this is very Enlightenment, yeah, mass literacy. I mean, this is maybe a delusion, but the idea is that mass literacy about the costs of business as usual, both at the systemic level, individual level, can actually increase this popular pressure for real. And we saw that the EU institutions actually reacted to this pressure 2 years ago. So basically making climate science on a par with math in school education, right? It's something you can't take the baccalaureate without climate science. And then I think the conversation will change quite drastically. Having strong executive institutions, right? This is the sort of like, power of the state, kind of the kind of almost the royal eminence of the state in this regard. Without environmental agencies that are as independent as central banks, that have real resources and real capacity and would be very hard to change and push by vested interests, I don't think we stand a shot, because the popular pressure has to translate into a public guardian. And this would be these national environmental agencies. That should not be the joke that they are now. They should be something else. We also have evidence, even from the IMF, that you basically can't curb inequality and basically stabilize a system amidst disruption without strong labor unions. So, laws that aim for 75% unionization are a guarantee that this stays democratic, right? Because these are the most democratic institutions out there, and a very extra parliamentary safety net against authoritarian tendencies. And finally, basically the constitutional amendments that institute the automatic reversal of states of exception, right? Because there's going to be many and repeated states of exception under climate change if we take scientists seriously. Now, there's a bunch of nuts to crack, right? So this is where I think the climate X people are right, and the current sort of left-green Keynesianism hasn't addressed this. Yeah. The law of absolute decoupling, so far it has endured, right? So reducing matter energy throughput to a sustainable level while the economy keeps growing. How can you do that? So far, there's no evidence. This is one of Garrett's very nice articles. Is green growth possible? There's no evidence of absolute decoupling that actually occurring so far. But I think the green Keynesians would say, yeah, that's because we don't have enough money. We'll have to spend 10 times more than what we are doing. It will still be 2.2% of GDP, so it's not crazy. And even if it's 5%, it doesn't come anywhere close to the cost of a financial crisis or something like that. Strong correlation between global GDP growth and CO2 emissions has clicked in with mathematical precision. How can we break this? Again, right, this is a big bet. There's no evidence for how this massively additional spending can actually do this. But if we combine science with macroeconomics and macrofinance, hopefully this is what we can get to. But it's weak terrain. So far, despite all the green technologies, the emissions have not been reduced simply because growth in other parts and consumption has increased correspondingly, and therefore we couldn't break the devilish cycle. There's the problem in Europe of East-West gap in perceptions. I mean, think of Minister Ghina in Romania trying to go for highways rather than trains, or Poland sticking to its coal mining until 2049. These are problems, but I don't think they're insurmountable. Effectively, these countries were, effectively bought out in the end, with the exception of Poland. Poland kind of stuck to it. Insufficient funding and very tired, useless ideas, I think, regarding how to compensate the losers. The just transition mechanism is a joke, I think. We know what happened in Valajiulu in Romania. I mean, this is about public housing. It's about job guarantees. It's about some guaranteed decent minimum income that could be provided to the losers. Otherwise, they will put on a yellow vest and burn your office. And securitizing climate refugee flows. There's no answer to that. How do you do that? One's fear and worst nightmare, and it's actually not an unrealistic nightmare, is that we can keep our nice left-green Keynesianism and go completely climate Mao on climate refugees, right? Estimated at 600 billion. And where will they go? There's no solution to carbon leakage, in the sense that Europe will green up, but all the brown activities will go somewhere else, right? Which doesn't really solve the problem because it's global. So far, there's no evidence this has actually happened. But at the level of greening that Europe is aiming, this can actually occur. In which case, we have to measure our carbon footprint by looking at imports, right, of finished products. And finally, no solutions to the problem of spillovers, right? The more Europe greens up. So what happens to the major fossil fuel economies? From Russia to Venezuela, they all depend on that. What about the rogue agri-powers like Brazil, right? If they don't react to the sticks and carrots from Europe, which is the biggest market in the world, the whole bet here is that Europe can use market power to change these exporters. But what can Russia change in its export profile? What can Venezuela or Nigeria change in their export profile to actually keep selling stuff from the European market? These are the issues that have come up. Let me conclude now. Essentially, I'm sorry, I have hit the wrong. All right. The take-home lessons is that averting extinction, this is on the existing calculations, does not mean evisceration necessarily. So that you've all seen the debate between Branko Milanovic and Jason Hickel, where famously Milanovic said, yeah, okay, tomorrow go and tell a Danish person they have to be 75% poorer. That's the cost of what you're suggesting. Massive oversimplification, of course. But it is a problem of selling this sort of change in consumption that this comes in the same package with. Well, if these numbers are to be believed, and I have no reason to challenge or to support them, but these are the numbers that we have, 2.2% of GDP. I'm saying let's go for the worst case scenario, or let's put 10%. It's not 10% of GDP. Doesn't sound like crazy for countries to put up with for 10 years, especially with this entirely changed macro financial infrastructure. It really costs less than a banal American war. It's hardly a terminal crisis of capitalism per se, right? You know, Europe's turn to this green enlightenment, as problematic as it is real. I think it should be credited as such. We'll see how it's going to work out. But it really can encompass a very broad spectrum of ideas, from more liberal ideas to more socialist ideas, especially when it comes to changing consumption and inclusiveness, public goods, public housing, consumption of public services rather than goods, etc. That said, okay, this may be modest, but Europe still has a lot of things in the armory. Like I said, green central banking, publicly owned green banks, they can make a huge difference, and they have not been deployed to their maximum capabilities. There's still very large European countries, such as France, where the percentage of public banks in total assets is tiny, right? But Germany is the exact opposite, right? So my anxiety personally is that this scenario that I kind of forced myself to be optimistic with can be completely cancelled by a brown Mao and green liberal Leviathan, right? That suffocates it, right? So basically, China is provoked into a conflict, and they don't go green. They stay brown to stay competitive. They have the rest of the world to trade with. And then the Americans keep on with a sort of wishy-washy green liberal state armed with sort of stratospheric technologies that they're betting on, right? And that leaves us in the lurk, because at the end of the day, European Union is accountable for 16% of carbon emissions in the world. So if we don't manage to pull this off and I think sort of mobilize others, it will be a nice, beautiful exercise and the second shot of the Enlightenment, but it's going to be mostly an aesthetic gesture. Thank you.
Thank you, Cornel, for this really enlightening, comparative and realistic too, comparative analysis of current ecopolitical projects for mitigating climate change, especially for the detailed presentation of the European Green Deal and the green financial reforms it requires. Thank you also for sharing your skepticism, if I understood well.
I tried to sound a bit more supportive.
Yeah. Okay. I think we can proceed now to the QA session. So we are open for questions
Okay, people, bring it on.
from the audience.